They say humiliation is loud, but mine was quiet. It came wrapped in applause, in the clinking of wine glasses and faux praise. It came with a polite nod from my nephew as he thanked me for everything I've done to support them, before dismissing me publicly in a voice smooth enough for a podcast. I was seated in the second row of the audience at something called Demo Underground, a local pitch night for fresh-faced tech founders who hadn't yet learned the art of listening. The exposed brick room buzzed with youth and irony, oversized hoodies layered over designer sneakers, pastel iPhones charging beside half-drunk matcha lattes. It was the kind of place where people pitched apps to make toast socially optimized. I was there for one reason: Ethan, my late sister's only child. A boy I practically helped raise after the divorce. I'd bought him his first laptop when he was 12, encouraged him to take apart my microwave just to see how things worked. I'd even invested the seed money for this startup when it was just an idea in a Google Doc, long before it was called Quanta. Now Ethan stood on stage under low-hanging bulbs, beside his co-founder Liam, both of them grinning in that dangerous way 20-somethings do when they believe the world owes them applause. Their slide deck behind them shimmered with terms like disruption, scalability, and AI-driven intimacy. I didn't know what half of it meant, but I knew how businesses lived and died. And I had opinions. "Any feedback from the advisory board?" asked a woman in the crowd. "I believe Ethan's aunt is one of the founding investors, right?" He smiled, too wide. "Ah, yes, Aunt Mel." A few heads turned to me. I gave a small wave. "She's been a great support, especially in the early stages," he said. "But you know how it is. Sometimes we need to update the firmware. Move past outdated software." A ripple of laughter ran through the room. My cheeks tightened. "She still thinks Excel is cutting edge," Liam added, winking at the crowd. "We love her, but this generation speaks a different language." The audience roared. I didn't. I just folded my hands in my lap and watched my nephew, my family, smile at the joke like it didn't cost him anything. Afterward, I walked out without saying goodbye. I didn't trust my mouth not to tremble. Outside, the air smelled like spiced garbage and something floral from the candle store next door. I turned the corner and found a tiny cafe still open, a pocket of warmth in a city that suddenly felt foreign. I ordered a single espresso, declined the syrup, and sat at a steel patio table that had seen better decades. From my bag, I pulled out the pamphlet they'd passed around at the event. Quanta, the future of emotional connectivity. Underneath the tagline was a photo of Ethan and Liam, arms crossed, shot in black and white with faux serious faces. The irony was, I didn't even care that they'd made jokes. I'd lived long enough to know that young men often built confidence on the backs of women they didn't fear losing. What I couldn't stomach was the hypocrisy, the polished marketing that erased the truth. They hadn't invented anything. They'd rebranded something I helped build. 3 years ago, they came to me with an idea for an AI-driven emotional tracking app, something that could predict arguments in relationships and suggest communication cues. It was charming, naive. I'd spent 30 years as a behavioral strategist for consumer brands. Emotional tracking wasn't new, but I told them I'd back them anyway, provided I had advisory input. They agreed. I wrote the first check. Now they were painting me as some doddering aunt who once owned a fax machine. I sipped my espresso. It was bitter and honest. I was wearing my old traveling shawl, charcoal gray, wool, worn soft, at the shoulders. My sunglasses were still on. Oversized tortoiseshell frames I'd once bought in Rome during a jet-lagged spree. They made me feel shielded, cloaked, invisible, but in control. 2 seats away, a group of younger women chatted over their laptops. One glanced at me, smiled, then looked away like I was someone's grandmother who'd gotten lost between Target and her Zumba class. I watched them type, brisk, efficient, startup girls. Probably interns for someone who thought I was irrelevant. That's when I pulled out my phone and opened an old email thread from a friend of mine, Sasha Wu, a woman I once mentored who now sat on the investment board of a firm that bought distressed startups for sport. I'd saved her contact under a single word: leverage. I hadn't spoken to Sasha in over a year, but she always said, "Don't ever let a room convince you you're finished. The minute they think you've stepped back, that's when you step in." I stared at her name for a long time. Then I hit compose. Sasha replied within 45 minutes. Her message was direct, professional, and as always, laced with an undercurrent of dry amusement. You always did know when to stir the pot. Let's talk. Zoom tomorrow, 10 a.m. my time. Use the link below. Below that was her Calendly link, a password-protected portal that only her highest-value contacts ever saw. I clicked confirm before I even finished my espresso. By the time I walked home from the cafe, the city had shifted moods, warm breeze instead of evening chill, cars honking and lazy rhythm instead of frantic. I passed 3 delivery drivers on e-bikes, a girl crying into her phone, and a teenager skateboarding in cargo pants, 2 sizes too large. Everything moved faster now. People didn't walk, they launched. The world was addicted to velocity, to now. But speed without direction is just chaos. I had always understood that. Back in my apartment, I changed into something simple, black cotton pajamas, bare feet on wood floors, and set my laptop on the dining table. I scrolled through Quanta's website again. It was clean, modern, all sans serif lies. There it was, the founder's story. Quanta was born from frustration. When Ethan and Liam realized traditional emotional support systems lack data-driven insight, they decided to build a tool for the future of connection. I almost laughed. The tool that had been sketched at my kitchen table 3 years ago, with Ethan pacing in mismatched socks and me scribbling behavioral response patterns on the back of a grocery list. They never mentioned the woman who taught them that emotion was not the enemy of innovation. They never mentioned me at all. Good. They wouldn't see me coming. Sasha appeared on my screen the next morning with her signature bun, sharp eyeliner, and a background that suggested she'd made peace with corporate warfare long ago. Bookshelves, abstract art, zero clutter. You look like someone who's been underestimated, she said, as soon as the call connected. I look like someone who's been insulted by a child wearing Yeezys, I replied. She laughed. I told her everything, how I backed the boys, how they gradually froze me out, and how the pitch event became my final dismissal. I showed her the original draft documents where I'd helped frame their first presentation to investors, including phrasing they were still using verbatim. She narrowed her eyes. Do you still have equity? Technically, yes. I own 18% through an informal SAFE agreement. Ethan never formalized the next round. I think they're stalling because they're seeking Series A with someone flashier. Fools, she muttered. That document is gold. She asked me a series of fast, surgical questions about their burn rate, their product maturity, employee churn, IP filings. I answered what I could and promised to send over more paperwork. Finally, she leaned forward. You want to make them pay, or do you want to own what they built? Both, I said, but I'll settle for the second. We spent the next 10 days building a strategy. Sasha called in favors, quiet ones. She had connections to 2 of Quanta's secondary investors, both of whom had grown uneasy about the startup's direction. Their KPIs weren't adding up, and Ethan's charisma had begun to crack under pressure. One even admitted they were considering an exit if a silent buyer could step in discreetly. Perfect. Meanwhile, I began assembling what Sasha called my quiet arsenal. I wasn't just going to reclaim a seat at the table, I was going to buy the table. I gathered all the original brainstorming notes I still had. Physical napkins, voice memos, early decks I'd reviewed with Ethan. Then I drafted a memo, a precise breakdown of my original contributions to Quanta, with timestamps, attachments, and witness statements. Nothing aggressive, just thorough. Next, I contacted an old friend in IP law who agreed to review Quanta's software build for any traces of my original UX logic. You're giving them enough rope, Sasha said, to pull themselves over the cliff. The first crack appeared a week later when Liam messaged me. Hey Aunt Mel, heard you've been asking around. Everything okay? I stared at the screen. He hadn't spoken to me directly in months. Not since they quietly edited my name out of their funding documents. I typed back, just checking on my investment. I'm sure you understand. No emoji, no warmth. His read receipt lingered for 10 minutes before disappearing. That Friday, Quanta made a public post on LinkedIn, announcing a major funding round in the works, boasting a sleek new advisory board filled with influencers and one former reality show therapist. It was performative. Hollow. Sasha texted me, smokescreen. They're nervous. She was right. Two of their minor investors had already signed letters of intent to sell their shares, and Sasha was finalizing a third buy-in through one of her shell core. With that, we'd hit 48% control. I needed just one more percentage point, and I knew exactly where to get it. The next morning, I called Ethan. He picked up, after 3 rings. I could hear coffee grinding in the background and the buzz of voices, probably his WeWork office. I pictured him in joggers and an expensive t-shirt, pacing with AirPods like he was starring in his own documentary. "Aunt Mel," he said, cheerful. "What's up?" "I'd like to meet," I said, face to face. He hesitated. "Is this about the event?" I didn't mean anything. "It's about my equity," I said flatly. Silence. Then, "Okay, tomorrow, 11. Ethan chose a downtown cafe I'd never heard of. One of those places with floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed ductwork, and baristas who referred to espresso as pulling a shot. Everything about it screamed curated chaos. I arrived 15 minutes early, as I always do, and chose a corner table facing the entrance. The hostess asked if I wanted to wait for my party before ordering. "I'm not here for company," I said. "I'm here for clarity." She blinked, then nodded, and left me alone. I ordered a single espresso. No sugar, no foam, just heat and honesty. When Ethan walked in, I saw it all over him. The practiced confidence, the casual swagger, the momentary flicker of discomfort when he saw me already seated and watching. He hesitated before approaching, just enough to betray nerves. "Aunt Mel," he said with that camera-ready smile, "you look great." "You look like someone who didn't sleep well," I replied. He gave a short laugh, then sat down across from me. His hoodie was too new, his watch too bold. He placed his phone face down on the table, an unspoken sign of respect that meant absolutely nothing. We exchanged no small talk. I let the silence do its work. "I've been hearing things," he finally said, "from our investors, about changes, rumors." "They're not rumors," I said. "They're transactions." He blinked. "You're buying up Quanta?" "No. I'm reclaiming what you tried to erase." Ethan leaned forward. "Aunt Mel, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this isn't the way. We're in the middle of negotiating with VRX Ventures. If they catch wind of instability, they'll walk," I finished. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm counting on." He sat back, stunned. "Why would you do this?" I sipped my espresso slowly. "Because I watched the two of you take what I built and paint it in neon like you invented it. You cut me out, laughed at me on stage, and now you want me to apologize for wanting a seat at my own table." Ethan ran his hands through his hair. "You're not seeing the bigger picture." "No, Ethan, I'm the only one who does." We sat there for a long moment, the sounds of steaming milk and idle chatter swirling around us like background music. Ethan's jaw clenched and unclenched. "You invested early," he said, measured. "That doesn't give you control." "Technically, no. But when your other investors lose faith, and some already have, it opens doors, and I'm simply walking through them." He stared at me, searching for something: weakness, nostalgia, doubt. I offered none. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said. "Neither did I replied. "But you taught me something, Ethan. You taught me how forgettable experience becomes in a room full of ambition, and how useful silence can be when used at the right time." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I leaned in just slightly. "You asked me here to talk, so here it is. I want the SAFE agreement finalized, retroactively dated and notarized. I want my advisory role reinstated, and I want a review of every IP asset that's used language or framework I contributed to. If you cooperate, I'll support a restructuring instead of an acquisition. If not, you'll wake up one morning and find yourself locked out of your own app." Ethan looked like I'd slapped him. "Why now?" he asked softly. "Why push this hard?" I smiled. "Because I know you're about to crash. You just don't see the wall yet." After he left, I stayed at the cafe. I watched his reflection disappear from the glass as he exited, slower than when he entered, like gravity had just remembered him. I pulled out my notebook. I didn't need to write much, just one sentence to anchor the moment. Power doesn't shout, it signs contracts. That night, Sasha called. "How did it go?" "He blinked," I said. "He'll come around." "Good, Because we got the final stake. 52%. The cap table flips tomorrow. I didn't exhale until she hung up. I'd spent decades in rooms where men explained things I invented, where they used my phrases and pitches, my insight and campaigns, my ideas and product decks, and never remembered my name when the award came in. This time, I woke up early the next morning. No alarm, just clarity. The sky outside was pale orange, the city still in its slower heartbeat. I brewed coffee, but made a second espresso, ritual, not need. Then I sat on my balcony, my shawl draped over one shoulder, my sunglasses shielding me from the sharpness of a new day. Quanta would go into emergency talks by noon. Sasha's legal team had already sent the restructured board announcement to their press liaisons. I wouldn't post anything, wouldn't crow or threaten, just a quiet correction of the record. I opened Ethan's Instagram. A new story had just been uploaded, him at a bar with Liam, clinking glasses, captioned, "To building the future, no matter who tries to drag you back." I tapped the screen and closed the app. Let them celebrate. The real future. It was already in motion. And this time, I was writing it. The meeting was scheduled for noon, but I arrived at 11:42. It wasn't about punctuality. It was about presence. The Quanta office sat on the 10th floor of a converted warehouse with all the expected startup trimmings, moss walls, neon mission statements, a smoothie bar that no one touched. From the elevator, you could hear the rhythm of keys clacking and someone over-enunciating on a Zoom call. Everything was performative, right down to the receptionist, who greeted me with a smile just polite enough to imply she didn't know who I was. I didn't mind. That was the beauty of invisibility. They never see the blade coming. "Boardroom?" I asked. She gestured down the hall. End of the glass corridor, last door on the right. I walked past framed news articles. Quanta, the app that listens, founders under 30 to watch. Ethan and Liam's faces stared back at me from every photo, lit like saints of disruption. None of the articles mentioned me, not even a footnote. I placed a hand briefly on the frame of the first article. I didn't need credit. I needed control. Inside the boardroom, they were already waiting. Ethan, Liam, two angel investors, and a corporate lawyer in a slate blue suit who looked fresh out of grad school. A screen on the wall flickered with Sasha's face, beamed in from San Francisco with her signature top knot and perpetual stillness. "Good morning," I said. Ethan stood and offered a limp handshake. "Aunt Mel." Liam just nodded. His face was flushed, jaw clenched tighter than necessary. The angel investors looked between them, clearly uneasy. "Let's begin," Sasha said through the speaker. "We'll keep this efficient." The meeting was a slow unraveling. Sasha began with the formalities, the updated cap table, the board's new composition, and the majority control acquired through legitimate means. She outlined the advisory clause I'd originally negotiated, long dormant, now activated with full voting privileges. She spoke like a surgeon, clean cuts, no wasted motion. Ethan interrupted twice. The lawyer objected once, claiming unfair pressure on private equity flows, which Sasha sliced apart with a single question: "Would you like us to go to arbitration or straight to the press?" Silence. I watched it all without flinching, my hands folded on the table, espresso cup cooling beside my notes. Ethan kept sneaking glances at me, like he wanted to say something off script, maybe remind me of Christmases past, or long-forgotten apologies, but I wasn't here for emotion. I was here for correction. "Let's talk about next steps," Sasha said. "The board is proposing a leadership restructuring. Effective immediately, Quanta will appoint an interim executive chair." Ethan's voice cracked. "That's not how this was supposed to happen." "No," I said quietly. "It's how it needed to." The vote passed. 3-2. The lawyer packed up his laptop with the kind of urgent energy that suggested he'd already texted someone under the table. Liam didn't speak. He just stood and walked out, not even pretending to hide his disgust. Ethan stayed seated. The room emptied slowly, except for him and me. I took one final sip of my espresso, lukewarm now, bitter in a different way, and slid my chair back. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said. "I do," I replied. "For the first time, I truly do." He looked up at me. "You think this makes you the winner?" "I think," I said, gathering my shawl over one shoulder, "this stops me from being the punchline." That afternoon I walked the 3 blocks to my favorite bookstore. Not because I needed a book, but because I needed something quieter than ambition. Something not built on metrics or virality. The owner, Grace, smiled when she saw me. "Back again?" she asked. "Always," I said. She handed me a folded receipt. "That poetry collection you asked for came in." I nodded and wandered the aisles until I found a stool tucked between the fiction and philosophy sections. I sat there for a while, reading a poem about endurance and silence. The kind of poem that doesn't try to impress, just reminds you of what you already knew. It was nearly 3 when I finally headed out. The city was in full tilt again. Horns, heat, motion. I passed a group of young founders gathered outside a pre-work, one of them gesturing wildly with a laptop in hand. Another woman sat on the curb, crying into her phone. A man argued with a barista over something called oat-nilla foam. The world spun on. But I didn't rush. Back at home, I returned to my balcony with another espresso and my notebook. I made a list of everything I needed to do in the coming week: stabilize operations, audit spending, hold a staff town hall, reframe Quanta's public narrative. At the bottom of the page I wrote, "Rebuild." But this time, in my name. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Heard what happened. Thought you were out of the game. Guess not. Would love to talk if you're open. Talia, CEO at Pulsebench." I stared at it for a while before typing, "You're not the first to think I was done. Let's talk Monday." Then I set my phone down, leaned back in my chair, and exhaled. They had called me outdated, but what they forgot was that foundations are never new, and I had just reclaimed the ground they were standing on. I held the first all-staff meeting in person, not over Zoom, not as a link in a Slack channel, face to face. It wasn't a power move, at least not in the way people assume. I just believe people deserve to see the expression of the person making decisions that will shape their work. If you're going to be someone's leader, they should know the lines on your face aren't cosmetic. They're earned. The conference room was bigger than I remembered. Sunlight spilled through the industrial windows and pooled across the polished concrete floor. Someone had rearranged the seating. Gone were the beanbags and modular ottomans. Real chairs. A proper table. Sasha's influence. No doubt. I arrived early, as always. Noticed the small things. The fridge was stocked with fancy sparkling waters. No one drank. The office plants had died in 3 corners. And the big mission statement on the wall, "Feel what matters," was starting to peel at the edges. It felt like an exhibit, not a company. One by one, the staff filed in. Some were familiar, developers I'd met in the early days, a product designer who used to nervously ask if I had any books to recommend. Others were new, younger, sharper dressed, carrying a confident detachment that said, "We don't know who you are, but we've already Googled you." That was fine. I preferred skepticism over hollow praise. When the room settled, I stood at the head of the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't wear a blazer. I wore my usual white blouse, dark shawl, espresso in hand. "I'm not going to read you a vision statement," I said. "You've had enough of those." A few smirks. "Good. I'm here because this company was built on an idea that wasn't just clever, it was necessary. The problem wasn't the product. The problem was the story being told about it, and about who gets to shape that story." Silence, but attentive. I continued. "You don't need to like me. You don't even need to agree with everything I do. But if you want stability, if you want clarity, if you want to stop fearing the next meeting with a funder, then you'll listen to what comes next." I outlined the plan. Restructure bloated teams into focused pods. Reallocate funds away from branding consultants and back into engineering. Launch a real beta, not a promotional stunt. Create opt-in emotional literacy programs for users instead of pretending data could solve intimacy. I told them, bluntly, that the first few weeks would be uncomfortable. Then I opened the floor. One engineer raised her hand. "What happens to Ethan?" "Ethan is stepping back," I replied. "He's not fired, he's not humiliated, he's just not the only voice in the room anymore." That seemed to land better than I expected. By the end of the meeting, a few hands had unclenched. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. Uncertainty is a wound. Direction is the bandage. The next few days moved like a current beneath my feet. I met with team leads, sat with product testers, ate lunch at the long communal table instead of hiding in the glass fishbowl office the previous CEO preferred. There were awkward stares, whispered comparisons. I didn't mind. I knew what it looked like from the outside, an older woman stepping into a startup world that worships 25-year-old billionaires in branded hoodies. But quietly, things began to recalibrate. The QA lead stopped by my desk with a list of flagged bugs she said no one had bothered to triage. The brand designer brought me her original sketches, ones Ethan had dismissed as too soft. They were stunning. By Friday, I saw it happening. The team wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. They were engaging, not because I'd won them over, but because I'd invited them to participate. That weekend, I didn't work. Instead, I visited the old farmer's market near the river, a place I hadn't returned to since Gerald passed. We used to go on Saturdays, always bickering over whether to get French roast or Ethiopian beans. He'd buy plants we didn't need. I'd pretend to hate it and smile when he wasn't looking. The stalls were mostly the same: local honey, handmade soap, too many herbal teas claiming to fix grief. I bought a small bag of beans from a vendor who looked like he wasn't old enough to drive. "Want a cup now?" he asked. "No," I said, holding the bag to my chest. "This one's for home." He nodded like he understood, even if he didn't. Sunday morning, I brewed that coffee slowly. I brought it out to the balcony, wrapped my shawl tight against the wind, and sat in the chair that creaked too much but fit me perfectly. I wasn't reading, I wasn't planning, just watching the city wake up beneath a cloudless sky. My phone buzzed on the table. A new email from someone I didn't recognize. Mira Corday, journalist. The Verge. "Heard you're the new chair of Quanta. Would love a quote for an upcoming piece on leadership turnover and age bias in tech. You're the first woman over 60 to hold a controlling stake in an emotional AI company. That's kind of a big deal." I didn't respond right away. I just sat there, espresso in hand, letting the morning fold around me. Some revolutions don't need noise, just a steady grip. And a name no one forgets the second time around. The article dropped Monday at 8:04 a.m. Not some buried blog piece. Front page. The Verge headline, bold and direct. "Old school or new power? How a 64-year-old woman quietly took over one of tech's noisiest startups." My name was in the subtitle. So was my age. That's how you know they think it's a novelty. I read the first paragraph twice. Mira had done her homework. She quoted the early SAFE agreement, cited 3 investors who'd praised my leadership for steadying the ship. She even referenced my background in behavioral analytics from back in the 90s, a time I was certain the tech world had erased from its collective memory. What stood out most wasn't the write-up. It was the tone, measured, almost reverent. The piece didn't frame me as a revenge story, it framed me as a return. By 9:30 a.m., my inbox was full. Subject lines like, "You're the kind of advisor we've been missing. Would you speak at our Women in Leadership Roundtable? We've never met, but your story gave me permission to stay." Some were clumsy, others deeply moving, but nearly all of them began with a shared phrase: "I didn't know someone like you could still." I didn't finish reading that sentence in most of the emails, because I knew exactly how it ended. Ethan didn't reach out, but Liam did. His message arrived just before noon, short and brittle. "Did you have to go public like that?" I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because there are some moments when silence says, you no longer get to shape how I respond. At the office, the energy was different, not reverent, just alert. I walked past teams who looked up a beat. Sooner, conversation stopped, but not in discomfort, more like anticipation. I knew the dynamic had changed, and I didn't revel in it. Power wasn't a drug for me, it was a lens. It showed me which faces turned curious and which turned resentful. The office manager, Serena, met me at my desk. "You've got 3 interview requests," she said. "Bloomberg, TechCrunch, and something called Feminist Frequency Live." I smiled. "Put the first 2 on ice. Send the third to Sasha. She'll know what to do." Serena hesitated, then added, "Also, there's someone here to see you. Didn't have an appointment. Said she used to work here." I stood. "Name?" "Kara Lynn." The last time I saw Kara, she was standing at a company retreat with tears in her eyes after giving a talk on ethical product design. Ethan had interrupted her mid-sentence to joke about how no one came here to talk about guilt. She'd laughed, then left the company 2 weeks later. Now she stood in the lobby in a forest green coat, hair shorter than I remembered, face unreadable. Her arms were crossed. Not defensively, but like someone holding herself together. "Kara," I said softly. She unfolded slowly. "I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." "I remember who left. I just didn't know why." She offered a brittle smile. "You weren't in the room when they made me feel like a joke." "I'm in the room now," I said. "Come upstairs." We sat in a quiet conference nook with floor-length windows. She sipped tea. I kept my espresso close. Always black, always centered. Kara didn't waste time. "I've been consulting since I left. Helping small apps scale their backends without violating user privacy. Most companies say they care, few actually do." I nodded. "But yours, Quanta. It started as something different," she said. "And I think maybe it still could be." "Go on," I said. "I've got a redesigned framework I've been using. Simple overlays to flag ethical friction. Moments where a prompt, a tone, even a font color could manipulate emotional responses instead of reflecting them." She pulled out her tablet. Pages of annotated screens lit up. Every change she suggested was small, but every change shifted power back to the user. "This is what Ethan called soft science," she added with a bitter smile. "Said it wouldn't drive engagement." "It won't," I replied. "It'll drive trust. And trust lasts longer." Kara stared at me, surprised, maybe even moved. "I'd like you to come back," I said. Her eyes flickered, seriously. "Part-time, contractor, if you prefer, no titles, just impact." She stared out the window for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that." That night, I walked home. Not for exercise, but for grounding. The city was lit in that strange dusk blue, half promise, half regret. Buses growled, neon signs flickered, and restaurant patios hummed with the kind of laughter that sometimes means joy and sometimes means performance. I paused in front of a mural I hadn't seen before, an abstract swirl of faces, young, old, painted in neon against slate gray. No one here was standing at the center, just motion, color, history blurred. I took a photo. For once, not to post, just to remember. At home, I brewed a final espresso and stepped out onto the balcony. The air carried the faint scent of warm cement and night jasmine. I wrapped the shawl tighter over my shoulder, sat in my usual chair, and opened the photo of the mural again. Not everything needed to be won. Some things just needed to be reclaimed. Quietly, precisely, without asking permission. I watched the skyline flicker against a backdrop of stars barely visible through city haze. I raised the espresso to my lips and whispered, "Not a toast, just a They may have built the app, but I rewrote the terms." It started with a quiet request. "Could we add a feedback box?" one of the developers asked during our weekly sprint review. "Not for the users, for us." I raised an eyebrow. "An internal submission form," he clarified. "Anonymous, so people can say what's not working without fear of backlash." My first instinct was suspicion. I've seen feedback boxes weaponized more often than I've seen them used well. But something in his voice, tired, sincere, made me pause. "Build it," I said, "but make it useful, no venting without context. Criticism comes with suggestion." He nodded, a little stunned that I hadn't brushed him off. The old leadership had treated input like a virus. Contain it, or deny it existed. But I'd seen what silence cultivates. It's not loyalty, it's rot. By Thursday, the feedback box had its first handful of entries. Some were constructive, some were uncomfortable. One simply read, "I don't trust the leadership, not to cycle back to chaos." Another said, "It's the first time I felt like this company is growing up. But I'm still waiting for the punchline." I read them in silence, alone at my desk. People weren't looking for miracles, just consistency. A chance to invest themselves without being discarded the moment a headline cooled. I copied one particular line into my notebook. "Don't make us feel like we're only useful when things are on fire." Underneath it, I wrote, "Stability before speed, people before press." That weekend, I visited an old friend from the early days, Mara Cohen. We'd started out together in a consulting firm, back when business cards were still embossed, and office politics meant actual politics. Mara now ran a nonprofit tech incubator for midlife career switchers, engineers in their 50s, designers in their 60s, retired school teachers learning Python. She called them the New Wave. We met at her office, a repurposed warehouse filled with workbenches, tangled cables, and the smell of old coffee and soldered wires. Still dressing like a paperback thriller heroine, she said, pulling me into a hug. And you still smell like printer ink and ambition, I replied. We talked for hours about everything and nothing, about how easy it was to be erased, about the assumptions that calcify around a woman once she stops coloring her hair or apologizing for her confidence. When I told her about Quanta, she leaned back and whistled. So you really did it. I didn't burn it down, I said. I just took back the match. Mara tilted her head. And what now? Now, I said, I open a different kind of door. That idea haunted me for days. Not in a haunting way, but in a calling kind of way. I started sketching late at night, something I hadn't done in years. Charts, roadmaps, names. Quanta, a program for older women, re-entering tech. Not a course, not a seminar. A full onboarding track into design, ethics, and emotional AI, built into the company's structure, not tacked on, like an afterthought. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had called me outdated. Now I would help others write the very code that would reshape the field they were told they no longer belonged to. I pitched the idea to the board during our next strategic review. I'm not asking for a PR stunt, I said. This is infrastructure. We aren't just building products, we're building access. There were questions, cautious interest, a few hesitant nods. But Sasha just smiled. Make it real, she said. I reached out to Kara first. You know anyone who could help structure the ethics curriculum? I know 10, she replied. And they're all people who've been told their intuition doesn't count. We started hiring, quietly. Women in their 50s and 60s who'd left tech after one too many rounds of being passed over for someone with a stronger Twitter presence. A woman who once built data privacy systems for NASA. A mid-career therapist learning a former school principal who now wanted to build education tools for neurodivergent kids. We didn't post job descriptions. We sent invitations. By early spring, Quantao had its first cohort, 7 women, 1 retired coder, 2 widows, 4 mothers. All brilliant. All nervous. They weren't sure they belonged. Until they saw me walk into the room. I introduced myself, not as CEO, but as someone who knew what it meant to be underestimated. The room didn't erupt into applause. It didn't need to. There was something better. A long exhale. The sound of women realizing they wouldn't need to explain themselves here. Not this time. That night. I couldn't sleep. Not out of stress, but because of a quiet hum beneath my ribs. A sense of arrival. I brewed a late espresso, stepped onto the balcony, and let the warm night wrap itself around my shoulders like a whisper of what I'd built. The city looked softer somehow. The skyline not as distant, a pulse of life I hadn't felt since I used to fall asleep beside someone who believed in me before I ever had a title. I sipped, thinking of those women in the cohort, of the spaces still to be made, of the version of myself who almost let it all go. And I whispered to the quiet, "You didn't age out. You just weren't supposed to start then. But now is exactly your time." You can tell the difference between a pilot project and a beginning by one thing: whether anyone still shows up after the first round ends. The final Quanta session wrapped on a Monday morning. The women were quieter than usual, not out of disappointment, but out of something gentler, a kind of reverence for what they'd built together. One woman lingered at the whiteboard after we dismissed, slowly wiping away her name as though erasing it might undo the growth she'd claimed. I stayed behind with Kara, watching as they trickled out one by one. "They're not the same women who walked in here," she said, folding her arms loosely across her chest. "No one should be," I replied, "not after reclaiming space that was never designed with you in mind." We stood there, silent for a while. No need to fill it. We'd filled it with work, respect, and a new kind of fluency, one not built on jargon or jargon's poor cousin, inspirational hashtags. Just experience, finally honored. Later that afternoon, I found Ethan, waiting in the lobby. He was seated beneath the new founder's wall, a subtle installation we'd recently reworked. The original had only included him and Liam in dramatically lit black and white portraits that looked more like actors in a startup-themed movie than real human beings. I'd replaced them with a mosaic of the first cohort sketches, UX plans, and handwritten notes. Real hands, real voice. Ethan stood when he saw me. "Aunt Mel," he said, tentative. I didn't respond right away. I gestured for him to walk with me toward the roof garden, a place most staff still forgot we had. The elevator ride up was awkward. He cleared his throat once. Then again, "I wanted to talk," he said finally. I nodded. We stepped out into the rooftop's quiet wind, where planters of lavender and rosemary lined the perimeter and 2 old benches faced the skyline. He waited until we were seated. "I've been watching," he said. "Everything you've done. I've been meaning to reach out. But pride takes time to dissolve," I said. He looked down at his hands. I didn't know how much I didn't know. That's the problem with being given the room before you understand what to do with it. He winced, but didn't disagree. "Look," he continued, "you didn't just fix the company, you changed the ecosystem around it. And I realize now that I was scared of irrelevance, of being passed over, of not having all the answers. You don't have to have all the answers," I said. "You just need to listen when someone else does." He looked up. "I want to learn now. Really learn. Not posture. Not pretend. Would you consider mentoring me again?" I studied his face for a long moment. It wasn't about revenge, it never had been. And it certainly wasn't about having him bend the knee. It was about whether he'd finally understood the difference between spotlight and stewardship. "Come by next Monday," I said. "No hoodie, no pitch deck, just a pen, a notebook, and a question worth asking." His eyes widened with cautious relief. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," I said. "You still have to earn the part where you're useful again." He smiled. Not wide, not smug, just honest. That was new. By the time I returned to my office, the sun had begun its early spring descent, warm light slanting across the floor in long amber rectangles. I took off my shawl, folded it neatly over the chair, and sank into the soft creak of the cushion. On my desk sat a stack of printouts, the latest usage metrics, feedback from our ethics audit, and 3 proposals from investors hoping to attach their name to our next round of development. None of it excited me. But one small envelope did. It had no return address, just a clean white card inside. "Thank you for building the kind of space I never knew I needed. My daughter applied to the next cohort. She said, if Grandma could, maybe I can too." There was no signature. Didn't need one. That evening, I walked home instead of calling a car. The sidewalks were humming, with the weather light jackets, half-sipped, couples sharing gelato, a jazz trio playing at the corner as if they were rehearsing for the opening credits of someone else's life. I passed a storefront that had just changed signs. Third Wave Bakery, with a pink neon heart above the door. A teenage barista glanced at me, through the window, then looked again. Recognition. Maybe not. Didn't matter. What mattered was that I no longer felt like a footnote walking down her street. Back home, I changed into something soft, boiled water for a late espresso, and stepped out onto my balcony, just as the sky turned lavender at the edges. The notebook was already on the table, along with a list of next steps: expand Quantao, finalize integration for Kara's ethics overlays, onboard 2 new advisors from the public health sector. I didn't touch the list. I just sat. Not because there was nothing left to do, but because, for the first time in a long time, I trusted that everything I'd started could keep moving, even when I wasn't in motion. The news broke before I had my second sip of espresso. Not from our team. Not from a planned release. It leaked intentionally or otherwise through a journalist I hadn't yet spoken to. Someone at a legacy tech blog got their hands on the Quantao expansion documents. Names, ages, bios, the entire strategy plan for integrating midlife female engineers into the company pipeline. The headline was a mixed blessing. Too late to code, not anymore, Quanta's gray-haired gamble. The article was sharp in parts, mocking in others. It focused too heavily on the women's ages, describing their backgrounds as charming anomalies rather than what they actually were, credentials. Still, it went viral, which meant the comments came next. I made the mistake of reading them. "This isn't a business, it's a sympathy program. Can't wait for Grandma to update the firewall with a crochet needle. Next up, TikTok tutorials from ladies who think USBs are vitamins. The cruelty wasn't surprising. It was boring in its predictability. But what I didn't expect, what I hadn't prepared for, was the echo that started inside me. A tremor of doubt. A whisper I thought I'd buried. What if they're right? At the office, the mood had shifted. Supportive, yes, but also on edge. You can feel when people are watching to see if you'll flinch, if your silence means composure or collapse. Kara came into my office mid-afternoon. She didn't knock. I'm pulling the team off Slack for the rest of the day, she said. Too many trolls trying to bait responses. I nodded. Good call. And I already filed a takedown request for the photos they used without permission. I looked up at her. You don't have to shield me. I'm not shielding you, she said. I'm shielding the work. Then she paused, softened. But I'm also making sure the first time this hits the wall, you're not standing there alone. That landed somewhere deep. And I didn't know how to say thank you without sounding like I needed the help more than I wanted to admit. I went for a walk at dusk before heading home. No headphones, no distractions, just the city humming around me like it always had, indifferent, pulsing, alive. I found myself on a block I hadn't walked in years, past an old bookstore now turned into a luxury eyeglass showroom. The name was still embossed in the sidewalk out front. Page and Vine. Gerald and I used to sit on the benches outside that store, trading theories on mystery novels we never finished. I stood there for a moment, remembering the way he always wore mismatched socks, and swore it was creative symmetry. A man in his 30s walked past me, glanced down at the store, then up at me. He smiled, polite, quick, and kept walking. But something in that look wasn't condescending. It was recognizing. Back home, I poured myself a fresh espresso, darker than usual. The bitterness was comforting. It reminded me that some things don't need sugar to matter. I sat on the balcony and opened my tablet. I skimmed another wave of messages, some cruel, some curious, and a surprising number quietly grateful. One stood out, from a 19-year-old girl in Wisconsin. My mom said she used to work in software, but quit when people stopped listening to her. I sent her the article. She cried. Then she opened her old laptop. Thank you. I put the tablet down and just let that sit beside me. Not a victory, not a headline, just proof. Proof that what we build, when it's built on truth, travels further than we do. Later that night, I pulled the old wooden box out from under my bed. It was dusty, unmarked. Inside were fragments of my former lives, an outdated ID badge from a long-closed consultancy, a USB stick labeled drafted, not used, a printed photo of me on a panel next to 3 men whose names no one remembered. I pulled out a folded note written by Gerald in a shaky hand from his final year. You were always the one they tried to underestimate. And you were always the one they couldn't outlast. I hadn't read that in years. This time, I didn't cry. I just folded it again and placed it back in the box. Then I closed the lid, not to forget it, but to remind myself I didn't need permission to continue. The next morning, I sent Kara a brief message. Let's expand the cohort. Add 5 more seats. One reserved for any applicant over 60. She replied within minutes. Already had 2 requests this morning. One from a retired Navy systems engineer. You're going to love her. When I arrived at the office, there were wildflowers on my desk. No note, no card, just color, defiant, gentle, unmistakable. Sometimes, that's all the affirmation you need. A week after the article storm quieted, I found myself alone in the Quanto workshop room, after hours, not because I had to be, but because I wanted to remember how the place felt, without applause or evaluation. The air still carried the faint scent of printer ink and the herbal hand lotion. One of the women, Mara, the retired midwife turned coder, kept at her desk. The whiteboard was cluttered with loops of logic diagrams, UX sketches, and questions scrawled in 4 kinds of handwriting. Most were surrounded by arrows and check marks. One was circled twice in thick marker. What does intuitive mean when intuition's been ignored for decades? That had come from Bina, 62. Used to build logistics software for a freight company before being laid off during a merger and told gently that it was a good time to retire. Now she was building predictive emotional response mapping for us, something our much younger lead engineer recently described as genius. I didn't see coming. Neither had I. Not fully. I left the board untouched and headed home early. I didn't want that room to get used to me. It belonged to them now. The street was soft with early spring fog, just enough to quiet the city's sharper edges. I passed the corner bodega where I used to buy tangerines before morning meetings. The new owner had rearranged everything, but the smell remained: citrus and ground pepper and aging wood shelves. Inside, a teenage cashier was trying to convince an elderly man that his expired Metro card couldn't be reloaded. "Sir, you need a new one. That kind doesn't scan anymore." The man looked lost. He clutched the old plastic card like it held his history. I stepped in gently. "I have a spare in my purse," I said. "You can take it and reload it later." He turned, eyes grateful. "Are you sure?" "Completely." The teen gave me a look, halfway between relief and admiration. "Thanks," the old man said. "My daughter usually helps me with this stuff, but she's traveling." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. "Been there," I replied. He tucked the card into his jacket, gave a small nod, and disappeared into the fog. At home, I didn't go straight to my laptop. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the small wooden stool in the corner of the room. Gerald's old reading stool. It used to wobble. I never got it fixed because something about its imbalance made it feel alive. I hadn't looked at it in months. Tonight, it looked like an invitation. I moved it to the balcony, set my espresso on it, and pulled my shawl around my shoulders as if bracing for something unspoken. There's a moment, always, in any movement, any real movement, where your body knows before your mind does that you've crossed some invisible threshold. You can't name it yet. You just feel the shift. For me, it came the next morning. It wasn't dramatic, it came with toast. Actually, I was halfway through breakfast when Serena buzzed from the front desk intercom. "Someone's here," she said. "Not an appointment. But I think you'll want to take it." I arrived to find a woman standing just inside the entrance, clutching a worn leather folio. Her face was familiar, though I couldn't place it immediately. "May I help you?" "I'm sorry to come unannounced," she said, voice trembling just slightly. "My name's Elena. I used to work with you. A long time ago. You probably don't remember." She opened the folio. Inside was a yellowing project proposal. My name was on the footer. "Midtown Systems," I said, the memory tumbling in. "The security software project." She smiled, relieved. "I was junior then. I wrote the stress test protocols." "You wrote the only part of the documentation I actually understood," I said. She laughed, but her eyes filled. "I saw what you're doing, with Quantao. I've been out of work for a long time. I left to care for my mother. Then no one would hire me. I stopped applying." I nodded gently. She clutched the folio like it was armor. "I just needed to see if it was real. If you were real." I didn't hesitate. "Come upstairs. I'll show you what we've built. And if you want to stay, you'll help us build what comes next." That afternoon, we sat in the sunlit kitchen area on the 7th floor, mismatched mugs in hand, the hum of the espresso machine in the background. She told me about the years she spent working out of her garage, about rejection emails, about being offered internships at 48 to prove herself again. When she finished, I said only this: "Let's never forget that there are women out there with code in their bones and no place to run it." Elena nodded, eyes wet. "I thought I was the only one left." "You're not," I said. "You never were. They just made you think so." That night, I sat on the balcony again. Same espresso. Same stool. But this time, I didn't feel like I was watching the world move around me. I felt like I had stepped back into the current, and that I was carrying others with me. Not because I had power, but because I finally knew how to use it without apologizing. The following Monday morning arrived with the kind of quiet urgency that told me something was about to shift. I didn't need an inbox full of alerts or Sasha's subtle tone changes on a board call to recognize it. You learn to feel disruption before it arrives, like the slight pressure change before a storm. Ethan showed up on time. No fanfare, no designer hoodie, just a navy button-down, a notebook tucked under his arm, and a look I hadn't seen on his face since he was 15 and brought home a failed geometry test. He didn't sit until I nodded, and even then, he waited to speak. "Where do we begin?" he asked. I took a sip of espresso and studied him. It was a strange kind of full circle. This young man, who once tried to edge me out of my own contributions, now sitting across from me, asking to be led, but the moment didn't call for retribution. It called for We start by unlearning, I said, and not just the bias against older systems or longer methods. We start with your resistance to stillness. He blinked. Stillness? You've built your entire leadership style around reaction, speed, pivoting, momentum, but none of it rests. None of it listens. Ethan opened his notebook slowly. Okay, he said. I'm listening now. We met weekly after that. Sometimes in my office, sometimes in the rooftop garden, where the scent of lavender made space for vulnerability. Sometimes in complete silence. I'd make him spend 5 minutes just sitting before we started talking. At first, he hated it, thought it was a waste. But by the 4th week, he no longer checked his phone. That's when I knew it was working. Not because he changed all at once, but because he began to pause before defending his ideas. He started showing me sketches, not just polished slides, and one day, almost sheepishly, he asked if he could shadow the next Quanto session. Not as a speaker, but as an observer. That was the first time I saw Kara soften toward him. She even poured him coffee without sarcasm. Progress. Meanwhile, something else was taking shape. Elena had quietly become a keystone in our redesign project. Her instincts were methodical and emotionally intelligent. She could spot when a UI flow would cause confusion. Before we ran testing, one of our junior engineers started calling her our UX whisperer, and it stuck. When I asked Elena how she felt about being back in a full-time environment, she said only this: "It's not about returning, it's about resuming." That line stayed with me all week. So I wrote it on the whiteboard in our main meeting room, in red marker. No attribution, just truth. 2 weeks later, we launched the next Quanto application window, and something happened that none of us expected. A tech journalist, not the sensationalist kind, but someone careful, respected, reached out and asked to shadow the program. Not to gawk, she wrote in her email. To learn. I'm 47, and I've spent 20 years writing about the people who got platformed while the people who knew stayed home. I invited her in. She arrived with a small notepad, no camera crew, and a look of curiosity I recognized from the early days of product testing, when people still believed what they were building could be both new and good. She sat quietly through an onboarding session where one of our new cohort members, a 61-year-old former therapist, presented a concept for an emotional feedback loop that would alert users not when they were anxious, but when they were overriding their anxiety to people please. The journalist turned to me after and whispered, "Why is no one else building like this?" Because they still think innovation means erasing everything that came before it. She wrote that down. That evening, I stayed late, not out of necessity, but because I wasn't quite ready to leave the hum of it all behind. The office had gone quiet. Most desks were dark, screens asleep. I stood alone in the main hallway, facing the wall we'd renamed the archive. It used to be just awards and press clippings. Now it held printouts of notes, UX maps, quotes, names, every single contributor, every age, every era. A small plaque sat at the bottom. It read, "Built by those you underestimated." I didn't add my name. I didn't need to. On the walk home, the city felt warmer than usual. Spring was beginning to tip into early summer, and the sidewalks breathed with conversation, music, and late commuters. I passed a group of students laughing around an outdoor chess table, one of them explaining the rules with theatrical hand gestures. I smiled, not because of nostalgia, but because I no longer felt separate from their world. I wasn't watching from behind glass anymore. I had returned to the table. Back in my apartment, I brewed one last espresso and stepped onto the balcony. The buildings shimmered in the evening heat, windows lit like constellations of effort and exhaustion. I pulled my shawl across my shoulder and thought of how far we'd come. Not just me. All of us who had been told our time was up, who answered, not with noise, but with movement. 2 months after we relaunched Quanto, we received an invitation from a global innovation conference. Main stage, keynote. The kind of slot reserved for unicorn founders in sneakers and t-shirts with motivational slogans. They wanted me, not as a panelist or to represent diversity, Not even because they'd finally grasped our impact. They wanted the story. Your arc is what everyone's watching. The email read. You reclaimed relevance in an industry that tries to timestamp people out of their prime. It should have thrilled me. It didn't. At least not in the way they expected. It felt like a moment we had earned. Not for applause, but for reckoning. Kara was the first person I told. We were seated in the corner booth of a cafe we'd started frequenting after long office days, the kind with quiet music, low lighting, and baristas who knew how to leave people alone. They want you to headline? She asked, blinking once, then laughing softly. Of course they do. I stirred the foam from my second espresso. It's not just me. I won't go up there as a myth. She nodded, understanding what I hadn't said. Then don't tell the story like you're the hero. She said, tell it like a map. I spent the next week rereading every piece of feedback from our programs. Not to cherry-pick praise, but to remember the language, the real language our women used. They didn't say empowered. They said things like, I remembered I could finish something again. I stopped hiding how much I already knew. I made peace with being underestimated. Then I moved past it. None of them had been waiting for a microphone. They'd been waiting for a door to open quietly and say, we see you. Come in. Let's start again. That would be the speech. Ethan offered to travel with me, said he wanted to witness it. I told him he could attend if he carried my bag and took notes like a proper assistant. He laughed and agreed. It was strange, watching him evolve. Not into a different person, but into someone stripped of urgency. He no longer filled silence with performance. He had become, as I once told him he could, useful again. Useful and curious. That was the part I hadn't expected. The night before the conference, I stood on the hotel balcony in Lisbon, wrapped in my shawl against the ocean wind. Below me, the harbor lights flickered across the dark water, and the city buzzed with soft, distant joy. Tourists, families, street musicians, echoing off cobbled walls. I wasn't nervous, but I wasn't triumphant either. It felt more like standing at the edge of something you spent your life building, only to realize the foundation had always been beneath your feet, waiting for you to look down and claim it. The next morning, I stepped into the wings of the conference stage. The host, a young woman with a headset and clipboard, greeted me with a wide, nervous smile. We're honored, she said. Honestly, it's about time someone like you got to tell the real version of innovation. I nodded, then paused. What's your background? She blinked. Oh, I studied computer science, but pivoted into event strategy. Tech conferences weren't made for people like me. Until you made them yours, I said. Her smile changed. Smaller now. Realer. She adjusted my mic and whispered, You've got 5,000 in the audience and 20,000 online. I smiled back. Let's see if they remember what being taught by a woman really sounds like. The spotlight was warm, not harsh, the kind of light that doesn't demand a performance. I didn't read from a script. I told them a story. Not of revenge, but of return. Of what it means to have ideas that outlast trends and wisdom that doesn't wear skinny jeans. I told them about Quantao, about Bina and Elena and Mara and the new applicants who had more experience in one failed project than most venture-backed prodigies had in 5 startups. I told them how age isn't a disadvantage in tech, just an unclaimed vantage point. And then I said the line I hadn't planned, but knew was mine the moment it left my mouth. I wasn't ahead of my time. My time was just waiting for me to stop apologizing for being here. The room went still. Then came the applause. Not loud, but long. Back in the green room, I took off my mic and sat in the quiet, alone for a moment. Kara appeared at the door, holding 2 tiny espresso cups. One for the woman who changed the rules, she said, and one for the woman who never needed them. I accepted the cup and raised it gently. To everyone they said was outdated. And to what comes next, she added. That night, I didn't return to the hotel. I walked the coastline path alone, past yellow street lamps and past dull storefronts, shuttered for the night. My shawl tugged at the wind, my feet moved slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of reverence. Because I knew, tomorrow, they'd write about the keynote. But tonight, no one was watching. And I had never felt more seen. The flight home was silent, in the way only altitude can make things feel, clean, weightless, suspended. I didn't speak much to Ethan beside me. He didn't offer conversation either. There was no need. We were both full of something heavier than words. He'd watched the keynote in full, not just from the audience, but through the eyes of someone finally learning what it meant to listen without centering himself. He didn't congratulate me when it ended. He said, "You changed the pitch of the room. They'll walk out hearing differently." It was the most generous thing he'd ever said. We landed in New York just after sunrise. The cab ride into the city passed in a blur of shifting light and early joggers, corner carts already steaming with the first batch of pretzels. At home, I didn't drop my suitcase immediately. I stood in the doorway for a few breaths, fingers still wrapped around the handle. There was no ceremony to returning. Just the hum of appliances, the scent of unopened windows, the half-drunk espresso cup I'd left rinsed beside the sink. But something was different. Not in the room, in me. The silence didn't ask me to prove myself anymore. It welcomed me, like I belonged. At the office, the mood felt subtly altered, like the kind of breeze that shifts before rain, but doesn't bring thunder. Kara met me by the elevator. She was grinning in that quiet way she did when something satisfying had just unfolded. "You missed a surprise," she said. "A good one, I hope." She handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Short, slanted script. "My mother watched your talk. Then she applied to Quantao. She was accepted yesterday. She hasn't looked me in the eye that confidently in years. Thank you for giving her back to herself." "Anne." I looked up at Kara. "Did you know?" She just shrugged, but her eyes glimmered. "Also," she added, "Alina left something for you in the archive." I found it waiting for me, under the contributors section, a framed printout of the original Quantao logo mock-up, the earliest version, rushed, slightly off balance, with the U too narrow. Below it, Elena had mounted a small plaque. "Design is never about perfection. It's about invitation." And this one worked. I rested my hand on the frame, just for a moment. It wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition. That afternoon, I sat in the cohort's workshop room as our newest group filed in. Women from every walk of life. A 72-year-old retired city planner. A stay-at-home mother whose youngest just started college. A former surgeon retraining in AI-assisted diagnostics. They didn't look nervous. They looked ready. I didn't speak to them from the front of the room this time. I sat among them. Second row. Notebook in my lap. Shawl wrapped tight. One woman leaned over and whispered, "Aren't you?" I smiled. "Just someone who didn't want to start over alone." She nodded slowly. "Same." That was the point. We ended the day with group journaling, a practice one of the returning cohort members had introduced, a chance to process transitions before they took root. The prompt was simple. What part of you are you reclaiming today? Some wrote quietly. Others cried. One laughed so hard she had to start over 3 times. I stared at my blank page for a while before I began to write. I'm reclaiming my right to be both finished and unfinished. To not be explained. To not be filtered through youth or softened for palatability. I'm reclaiming the part of me that never stopped being sharp, only quiet. And I'm done being quiet now. That evening, as the sun melted down the sides of the skyline, I returned to my balcony with a fresh espresso and no intention of checking my phone. The city glowed like it understood everything I couldn't say aloud. Every window a pulse of life. Every rooftop a reminder that history isn't written by the loudest voice, but by the one that outlasts the trend. I sipped slowly, letting the bitter warmth settle at the back of my throat. There was no announcement, no toast, no final word. Just the simple truth that I had done what they said couldn't be done. Not loudly, not spitefully, but fully, and completely on my own terms. The wind picked up slightly, and I reached for the edge of my shawl, draping it tighter. Below, the city moved like it always had, fast, beautiful, unforgiving. But I wasn't trying to keep up anymore. I had built my own lane. And now, others were walking it too.